Russian missile and drone strikes overnight into Sunday killed at least one person in Ukraine, including a man in the Chernihiv region, and causing power and water outages in the industrial city of Kremenchuk, home to a major oil refinery. Ukraine says Russia aims to cripple its energy grid for a fourth winter. The renewed attacks coincided with the end of 3 days of U.S.-Ukrainian peace talks in Florida. President Zelensky said he received updates and vowed continued cooperation with Washington to reach a genuine peace. Outgoing U.S. envoy Keith Kellogg said negotiations are in the final stage, hinging on control of Donbass and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov praised the Trump administration's new national security strategy for emphasizing dialogue. Former Ukrainian Prime Minister Nikolai Azarov claimed the U.S. may remove President Volodymyr Zelensky if he obstructs Washington's efforts to resolve the Ukraine conflict. He argued that corruption probes into Zelensky's closest allies by Western-backed agencies indicate a plan to oust him. Several top officials, including the Justice and Energy Ministers and Chief of Staff Andrei Yermak, have already resigned over a €100 million graft scandal. Putin has said it is legally impossible to sign peace with Zelensky, asserting he lost legitimacy after canceling elections. Polling shows Zelensky's popularity is declining. Russia's SVR previously alleged U.S. and UK officials discussed replacing him. Amid growing alarm over mass immigration, Ireland has seen the launch of a women's coalition on immigration, led by barrister Louise de Bruyn, to press for protections for women and girls and full disclosure of migrant-related sexual offense data. A new report comparing crime statistics across 6 European nations claims foreign nationals are 3 to 4 times more represented in sexual crimes on average, with Afghan and Pakistani migrants up to 15 times more likely to be implicated in Italy. De Bruyn argues Irish authorities downplayed the link between migration and sexual violence, citing a recent case of a 10-year-old girl allegedly raped by a migrant housed by the state. The coalition demands transparent statistics so policy can be evidence-based rather than driven by political correctness. Elon Musk has called for abolishing the European Union and restoring national sovereignty after Brussels fined his social platform X €120 million for allegedly violating the Digital Services Act censorship rules. Musk argued the EU is undemocratic and suppresses free expression. U.S. officials echoed criticism, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio calling the fine an attack on American tech companies, and Deputy Secretary Christopher Landau accusing Europe of relying on U.S. defense while undermining U.S. interests through EU policies. The Trump administration warned Europe faces civilizational erasure due to globalist agendas including censorship, open borders, and supranational governance. French far-left MP Raphael Arnault, a leader of the Antifa-aligned Young Anti-Fascist Guard in Lyon, has a finalized conviction for aggravated assault linked to a 2021 group attack on a man they believe to be a right-wing activist. He received a 4-month suspended sentence and must pay €1,600 in damages after dropping his appeal, making the conviction definitive. Reform UK leader Nigel Farage calls Reform UK the positive party of change and hope.
Do you know why? The people of Scotland know it already. They know it already. And there is a huge gap in the political market. And do you know what people want? That one 4-letter word. No, not that one. It's one 4-letter word. Hope, 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 hope.
This has been James O'Neill for The World Today.
There is a problem with medicine, and we can explain what it is by looking back to the discovery of penicillin. Penicillin, it turns out, was not just an accidental finding. Alexander Fleming discovered that mold he found in a culture dish was killing bacteria, but it took over 10 years before a team at Oxford University were able to isolate the active ingredient. They produced small quantities for preclinical and clinical trials, helping prove the compound was safe and could beat infection. However, they couldn't produce it at scale. In 1941, Andrew Jackson Moyer of the US Department of Agriculture, the forerunner to the FDA, suggested changes to the manufacturing process, enabling mass production. It turns out medicines are not invented when someone discovers a new molecular entity. They are the product of key stakeholders working together collaboratively. Until medicine can be manufactured at scale, it may as well not exist. And in 2025, this is a problem. In the 1980s, pharmaceutical companies began outsourcing production. Suddenly the system was significantly less integrated. Someone with a new discovery today will find themselves disconnected from the rest of the development and manufacturing process. Companies that develop medicine are still happy to work with big established pharma companies, but the modern day Flemings are cut out of the system. The result is far fewer new medicines coming to market. We want to fix this by ensuring the pharma industry builds a more integrated supply chain. We also believe that doctors' expertise administering medicine should be included at the beginning of the process. We know that doctors on the front line have insights about how to repurpose medicine. Doctors should be able to report their findings so that the necessary testing can be completed and they can share their results worldwide. Learn more here and help us take medicines back to the future.
With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today, telling it as it is. This is today's News Talk, The World Today.
And welcome to the protagonist here at the World Today. Germany's return to conscription, the military service bill and its wider implications is our topic for the panel today. And it's a very, very good panel indeed. Germany's parliament has just passed a law requiring all 18-year-old men to complete a questionnaire and medical check starting January 2026 as a step to strengthen the military amid Russia's war in Ukraine and NATO's pressures. Now, the service stays voluntary with a €2,600 monthly pay, but needs-based conscription could follow if recruits fall short, potentially by a lottery. Students protested en masse, prioritising schools, climate action and freedoms over arms buildup, while a poll shows 81% of young people are unwilling to fight. Defence Minister Boris Pistorius welcomed the demonstrations as proof of democracy, even as the nation aims to expand forces to 260,000 by 2025. Why Germany is doing this is on the surface quite obvious. The war in Ukraine is not going to plan, the economy is failing, energy bills are rising, there isn't enough money for pensions, but they are seriously going to send bodies into a foreign war, or do they really expect Russia will attack? Is this an empire on the verge of panic? One wonders. As I said, our panel is very good. Professor Hall Gardner is an American University professor at the American University of Paris. Robert Sibis is from Oval Media, and Dr. Ralph Scholhammer is a geopolitical analyst. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Hall, can you just give me just a brief overview on your thoughts on what has transpired within Germany on the subject of conscription and why they're heading in this direction?
Well, I think Germans feel that they're caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they see the Russian advance into Ukraine and the nuclear threats that they fear from Russia. On the other hand, and I actually think is more important, is the fear that the Americans are going to pull the rug underneath them and not support NATO if there really is a clash between Europe and Russia. So the Europeans are not just Germany, but the UK and France, the EU3 in particular, are trying to build up almost on every dimension, building up their military capabilities, their nuclear capabilities. France is talking about it covering, having its nuclear with the UK covering all of Europe. And then conscription, you don't fight wars without people. So all these countries are at least pushing for greater conscription. It reminds me of what George Kennan said way back in 1997, that by pushing Germany at the forefront of NATO enlargement, you are unleashing, or you're opening up the ghosts of the past. You're bringing back the whole history of the European crisis that took place after World War One, and we're seeing a real paranoia developing, particularly in Europe, as it's being crushed or caught between these two demons, the Russians on one side and the Americans pulling out of Europe like they did after World War One. The United States is threatening that again. So that's
Robert Sibbers from Oval Media in Berlin. What's your just brief overview on what your thoughts on where it's going to head to? You'd probably need to turn your microphone on, Robert. That's that little button. We have no life. I'll go to Ralph Scholhammer here, just to while Robert gets his microphone working. Ralph, what's your thoughts about what's transpiring at the moment?
Well, I think that Professor Gardner gave a very, very good overview, and he said something very crucial, which is that you can't fight wars without people. And if we look at the people in the UK, if we look at the people in Germany, if we look at the people in France, I think at the moment, at least, there is not really an appetite for conscription. And this is the big issue. I mean, the Europeans, or the Western Europeans, to be more accurate, for the last 40 years have been socialized and marinated in a very pacifist worldview. And again, I have no problem with this. I mean, there was the hope, it was the whole end of history thing. There was this idea that war is something of the past. And I don't think that you can reverse this with just making new laws. I mean, as you just heard, there's about 80% of young Germans at least express some unwillingness if they should be conscripted. I mean, currently it's more on a voluntary basis, but if it should happen, we had protests at schools. So I think a lot of this is understandable from the political perspective, why Friedrich Merz is doing it and why the coalition government is pushing for it. But I think that the people at the moment have no appetite to go along with it. A lot of this will exist on paper, but I'm afraid that if you would really put it to a test, the whole thing could potentially crumble.
Robert, what's your thoughts? No, we haven't got any sound there at the moment. So we're having a problem at the moment. So what we can do is maybe if you can just probably reconnect, Cam will help you out there. And I'll go back to Hall. Hall, okay, we're talking about Russia here. We're talking about Russia, and Russia's being a very bad egg at the moment, according to NATO, but they're not really. What's the end goal of Europe? Do they want to have a war with Europe, or is it with Russia, or is it just a bit of posturing to show you that they got an extra set of gonads?
I would say the Russians don't want war of Europe. Putin has said that several times. He doesn't want to fight NATO. On the other hand, the Europeans are strongly backing Ukraine, or at least trying to. Not that they have really done everything they could possibly do to support the Ukrainians. But
Hi there.
In my view, they need to, go ahead and support President Trump's peace program rather than engage in this gigantic military buildup that they're starting. That way they won't need to build up. But they don't seem to feel that logic. But that's why I said before, the real threat here is in the European view. It's not so much the Russians, but in fact the fear that the Americans won't back them. And so they're, as I said, they're caught in between this rock and a hard place, where they feel the rug is being pulled out, that they don't have the supports of NATO, and therefore they have to come up on their own with their own defense capabilities. And I think they're overdoing it. And I really think the Germans, the French, and the Brits should get behind Trump's peace plan and at least try to make a good deal out of it.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I have to agree with you. Yeah, it's pretty interesting behind. We have now Robert Sibbers. We can actually hear you, Robert. No, we can't hear you. We heard you before. It's incredible. Always the best laid plans of mice and men. Ralph Scholhammer, could you just tell me the perceived security risk with Russia? Does this justify if people are believing it, which I don't think most of them are, I think 81% don't. But if they are believing that Russia is posing a problem, does conscription justify this at the moment? Because I can't see how it does. When you have 81% said we're not going to go out and fight for you, I mean, it shows you have a real problem, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, you know the old saying that where there is smush, there is push. And I think from the Russian perspective, if they perceive Europe to be weak, I would not be surprised if they would be more willing to continue an expansionist policy. Deterrence is still a real thing. And at the moment, I mean, this is what we saw 4 years ago. The Europeans are not very good at it. And this is partially, as I said, due to domestic policies. I think this is partially due to ideological reasons. There's a whole hodgepodge of causes. But the idea now, and again, I think Professor Gardner described it quite nicely, but the idea now that you can reverse this within a year or within a very short amount of time, when a new attitude, let's put it this way, has been deeply socialized into the majority of the population, is very, very difficult. I mean, the Germans, I would say, and no, I'm Austrian, so I think I can, no, I mean no disrespect as I'm not German, but I know them well enough. I mean, they are just as obnoxiously pacifist now as they once have been obnoxiously belligerent. But this is not something that you can change overnight. So you tell people for decades, since the 1970s at least, even during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was still a real and present threat, that war is not the answer, and make love, not war. All these things that were very popular in Germany as much as in the United States. And now you say from one day to the next, oh my God, this was all wrong. We all have to get ready for a warlike economy, and we have to be ready that potentially we need conscription and fight against the Russians. Again, whether or not one agrees or disagrees with the objective, I think that is secondary to the fact that the population has been told for decades this is never going to happen, this is morally wrong, this is politically wrong, this is economically wrong. And now you try to make a 180-degree turn within a very, very short amount of time, and I don't think that is possible. Whether we agree with it or not, I just think it's not possible.
Hall.
If I could, I totally agree. I totally agree with that. I just want to add more on point. The Europeans have been blamed for not building up in the past, but it's not true. The Americans actually kept Europe down. Madeleine Albright had a policy of 3 Ds, basically mean no duplication of NATO assets. Europeans were held down by the Americans. And so the Americans, by not allowing Europe to build up their defense capabilities over time, have created this disaster. And we've also created it by pushing NATO and right up to Russia's security into a security area. So and that's another part of this problem. It's not just Ukraine. It's the fact that NATO has surrounded Kaliningrad. That's another big issue that the Russians are worried about. And that's creating tensions with Europe, particularly as NATO entered the Baltic states, and now it's Sweden and Finland. That's created tensions with Germany as well. So and NATO in general. So this whole crisis is much deeper than Ukraine alone, and that's another reason why the Europeans are a bit paranoid about it and are going on a last-minute rush to build up forces. But as I said, had we worked with the Russians and the Europeans throughout the Cold War, the post-Cold War period, we wouldn't be in this crisis right now. But
Robert Sibbers, we think we have all systems go. Your thoughts, please.
Germany is on a slippery slope. It's. Do you hear me? Just to make sure sound is working. Yes, wonderful. It's crazy. We call it in Germany salami tactics. We prepare so much for war that after some time you feel you want the war, even though in fact initially nobody wanted that war effort coming. It started with General Breuer, who is now the highest general in the German army, saying 2 years ago we need to be ready for war in 2029, and the conscription law is, of course, one of these little steps. We don't call it conscription, by the way, here in Germany. Even though there's integrated a needs-based conscription in that very law, but it's not mandatory. But you just have to give your name. You just have to fill in a form. there are many things like this where you start to get used to the idea that Germans might fight a war, um, but it's so far away from what Germany has been 10 years ago or 20 years ago, for sure, that it needs this if German soldiers should really fight and die on a front line. Um, I just want to give three other examples. The Chamber of Commerce is organizing sessions with small company owners um, um, to train them how to structure their work, their business, if people are missing because of the war effort. You have the Deutsche Bundesbahn, the train systems being reorganized so that they can transport wounded, fallen or wounded soldiers. Um, you have the biggest military hospital in Europe and the second biggest in the world being built and ready in, I think, some months' time in Ramstein, close to the main military base of the United States. So a lot of things are changing. And of course, you mentioned that there were some protests against that new law in Germany. Students have been demonstrating. And in fact, you had a campaign against it, though, in the mainstream media, saying, look, if you are protesting, then you might not go to school. And if you're not going to school, it might cause problems with your teachers. Pay attention. This kind of messages have been sent. It's very funny because the Fridays for Future have been extremely important in Germany. And the messages given by the mainstream media, of course, were opposite. They said, oh, if you just don't go to school, that's fine. Just go on the street and demonstrate. So you see that the overall propaganda is very much towards the war effort. And I feel it's not really coming from the population, from the citizens. It's coming from rather the corporate structures and the government.
Yeah, I just find it very disturbing. Ralph, can you just tell me your thoughts here? Because it would seem that hell or high water, they're going to, we're not putting up with those pesky Russians anymore. And if you look at what Sweden's done, according to Mats Nielsen, now Sweden have or are about to take hold of a bunch of new missiles so they can fire into Russia. That would be very unfortunate, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, there is a saying which again is correct, that wars are very often planned by old men, but usually they are fought by young men. And this is one of the key problems that we have all over Europe, even in Poland and let's say more potentially belligerent states, that we have a massive demographic crisis. The average German is in his late 30s or early 40s. And if you subtract the migrant population, it is not entirely clear whether recent Germans or recently acquired Germans, let's call it this way, how willing they would be willing to fight for Germany. So there's a whole lot of problems that simply did not exist in these periods that we like to use for historical comparisons, whether it's 1914 or 1939 or even the 1950s or the 1960s. The Germans are older, they are more diverse, and in this case, I mean, this is a weakness, because if you want to fight a war on behalf of a nation, there needs to be a sense of a nation. I don't think that the Germans have this to the extent they had it in the past. I don't think that the other European nations have this to the extent that they have this in the past. Now, I also think, by the way, that the Russians have similar problems. Demographics are not very rosy in Russia either, but it seems that the regime there was preparing their population longer than anybody else. And I don't want to repeat myself. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think the cultural conditions, the demographic conditions, they make the actual execution of all these plans very difficult. Now, you mentioned correctly, right? You can buy new rockets and new tanks, and you can build military bases, and you can build the largest military hospital. All of this can be done. But I think it was Napoleon who said, correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't want to put something into the old horse's mouth, but I think he said that all the best plans disappear once the first shots are being fired, or once you hear the roaring of the cannonballs. And I think that's also true here. So how many Germans, hypothetically, how many French people, how many Brits would really be willing to go and fight, in the Donbass? This is the most extreme case. I don't think it's going to come to this, but hypothetically, And there's then always the other question, which we probably can touch upon, and we're very curious to hear what the others have to say. There is a sense, not among a majority, but a significant part of the population of these Western European countries, that over the last couple of decades, the political class was not willing to protect domestic borders, keyword migration, but apparently now they're willing to protect a foreign border. Now, as I said, whatever we think about these two things separately, when you put them together, there's a sense of unfairness and injustice among parts of the population. And I don't think that this can be entirely neglected.
Hall, I'm just thinking, I saw a video the other day with Glenn Beck, who was talking about, he said, never before in history have we reached a particular point where all economies or nations or countries or whatever, strong ones, have been in the same situation. That is, they're starting to go down. They're feeling the pressures of economic uncertainty, their dollars or their currencies being devalued and all that sort of stuff. And when that happens, normally if one's going down, the other would go up. But if you look at the history of wars throughout time, it has been particularly when that particular nation or country or is in trouble economically. They have high unemployment, the currency is not worth much, things aren't going as it should. It's a nice way of bringing people together, isn't it, until you kill them all, into saying we must defend, for example, Europe against these evil Russians. And another point to that is that not many other political parties are in opposition to this. So if that's the case, are they preparing, is it a foregone conclusion that there's going to be a stoush between Russia and Germany and other European nations sometime, say, within the next probably 6 months, 12 months?
Well, I hope not. I've been arguing that for quite a while now. We're in a mix of a pre-World War I and pre-World War II situation. I can get into the analogy. It'll take me too long, but basically, the collapse of the Soviet Union in the past opened up the door for the pre-World War II analogy when. Just like Imperial Germany collapsed and opened the door for Hitler. Now, Putin is not Hitler. It's a totally different situation. And that's where the World War I analogy comes in, but I won't get into the details. But the problem is we are at a point where the system could collide, where the dynamics of Russian efforts to rebuild the Russian Federation begin to collide with European efforts to expand into Central and Eastern Europe, with the Ukraine as the focal point of crisis, and that's where. But it's not just Ukraine, as I said a minute ago. The expansion of NATO to the Baltic states, now Finland and Sweden, has created a potential polarization. But because both sides don't even communicate with each other, the possibility of war is quite real. And that's where the United States, for once, has come into the middle of this, and at least under Trump, is trying to break that, open the doors to communication between the two powers. But the Europeans aren't moving moving towards communication. Because, as I said, they also fear the Americans. So the point is, I agree with you. We're at a very dangerous point, and the economics aren't good either. Because when you have high unemployment, a good way to get people employed is to put them in the military. But that creates this, what I call insecurity dialectic, where both sides see the other side is building up their military capabilities, and that goes nowhere because both sides just continue to arm.
Robert.
So we're caught on an economic and a geopolitical level into a very dangerous torrent, and it's not sure to me that we're going to be able to pull ourselves out of it before it's too late.
Yeah, I think so. I'm sort of agreeing with you here. And Pella Neroth-Taylor, who often comes on with us, ex-TNT workmate, he would also agree. Robert, what do you think?
I think you made a good point, Mike, in saying this is all not that logical. I mean, there's a lot of morality in the communication. We should defend Ukraine and we should sacrifice the economy or risk the lives of our young men in that war. These are messages sent through various TV shows, documentations, or what politicians are saying. And it's, of course, contradicting what has been said during the COVID era, where we said, we should risk the lives of people through these jabs, and we should also limit our lives and destroy our economy just to support the elderly. But now we should risk the lives of the young. It seems a bit always that the morality is coming to sell something which, in fact, nobody really wants. Now, people didn't want the COVID measures. People don't want the preparation for a war. And also, if the Russia is so strong in terms of military, which in fact they are, why would they wait? Why would they wait for years and years for Germany to build up a basic military structure? One thing is for sure true, that militarily Germany wasn't strong at all. So it feels like, the obvious question is, why is this happening? And I think what is happening is not in the interest of Germany and not in the interest of Russia. And a lot of people said it. I think I should repeat it. It is, of course, in the interest of China and the United States if there is a confrontation between Western European countries and Russia. And I feel that we are lured into a war which is against all interests of all Europeans. And then you can become, of course, suspicious if you see that the people, the highest ranking general in Germany before General Breuer was General Zorn, and he said Ukraine will never win against Russia. And he was fired for that reason. And the guy who managed the COVID measures, General Breuer, then became from a 2-star general, a 4-star general, and took his place. And he just says what the politicians saying. And who are the politicians? Friedrich Merz, was the director of the board of BlackRock in Germany. And before being, besides being a politician, he also was a lawyer working in selling mid-sized companies in Germany to United States corporations. And so he always had a very strong link to the economy and the political system in the United States. And I could give 100 reasons for this. So the overall question a lot of people in Germany are asking is he an agent for the United States with the aim of weakening the economy of Germany, or even with the aim of destroying Germany? What do you think?
Yeah, what do you think, Joel? Ralph, sorry.
Well, I think there's a tendency among Western. I always make this distinction between Western and Eastern Europe, but particularly among Western Europeans. But I have to say that I mean no disrespect or disagreement necessarily with Robert, but also particularly in Germany, that if something goes wrong, it is somebody else's fault, and if something goes well, it was all our own genius. And I said this is for all of Western Europe. I mean, just take a couple of examples. It is often forgotten, but a lot of the pipeline network that connected Europe with Russia was built during the Cold War against massive resistance by the United States. Ronald Reagan was absolutely against it. The Europeans didn't care. They did it anyways. Nord Stream 2, before it was blown up by, well, I guess we all have an inkling who did it. But this was also done against the resistance of the United States. The Germany didn't care. They did it anyways. So I'm always a little bit wary when there's this idea that's very popular that the Americans, for all the mistakes they have made, and there are plenty, like every great power makes mistakes, but there is some way to weaken the Europeans. For the most part, the Europeans are responsible for their weakness themselves. Nobody forced Germany to turn off nuclear power. Nobody forced the Europeans to indulge in green deals and all these weird new ideas. Nobody indulged or forced German companies to make deals with the devil in China. Like, the idea was, from the European perspective, you can do business with everyone. Realpolitik is something of the past. It no longer matters. And now the bill is coming due. And as it turns out, we might not be able to pay it. Now, as I said, does it mean that everything the United States did was well? Absolutely not. Did they have, as also Professor Gardner said before, like that there was some geopolitical interest to not allow Europe to stand too much on its own feet? Yes, absolutely. All of this is true. But we shall not forget, a lot of this was done with clear approval by European nations, because it was nice. to
Ralph,
spend
I
less.
completely
Just this last point, just last point, because it was nice to spend more on the welfare state and less on the military. It was nice to have the American security umbrella. It's even, by the way, nice to have American military bases in your own country because they bring money from abroad that they spend then locally. So a lot of this, what Europeans tend to complain, I'm not sure if they really want to do without it. Now, I'm being deliberately provocative here, but you know what I mean.
I know what you mean, but it's really, of course, a big change has been the fall of the wall, and that Western Europe isn't the model that had to stand against the communist system. So things have changed in the year 2000 and end of the 90s, especially in the relationship between the United States and Germany. And by the way, if the aim of the United States would be to harm Germany's infrastructure the most, it's best achieved if you let them build the infrastructure in Germany and then destroy it right after it's built and right after it's working. So to see benevolent aspects in all of this is difficult today. Again, Western Germany has a different role, and now we have also coming up China and the United States, and it feels for me as if they would team up to let Europe go down so as to flatten the economic differences, so that Europe might, Germany might be as poor as Romania in a couple of years. Also for many reasons, but also if the part of the unqualified population is higher, of course it's easier to make even ground with other countries, because the German population has been quite highly qualified, and there are a lot of aspects. And if you destroy the infrastructure, it's not just coming from the population. It's not just that the Germans are stupid. It's the leadership. The leadership made a campaign for this and that aim, and it has been supported by big corporations. So the one that I wonder, of course, where is this coming from? Where is this money coming from for it? And I fathom that there are interests in the game. I don't say there's a single reason for what is happening. There are certainly many reasons. And I don't underestimate the complexity, but if you see how strongly the agenda goes into one direction all the time, I am quite suspicious of it. If we had something coming from the population, would have many more voices. If today I would say, I want to be friends with Russians, I want to promote their culture in Berlin, I would have so many enemies. I couldn't even work with any bigger corporation nor with any public broadcaster anymore. So it is not. Just the final thought. I just want to add: this is not you leaving democracy if you go into war preparations. Hannah Arendt said, to have a totalitarian system, you're losing the classes to create masses. You have the mass formation, which you certainly have heard of, and this is what is happening. We are the social structures have been destroyed, and I'm not talking just about Germany, but about all of the Western world. And this is, of course, a precondition to a war effort, because a war effort is anti-democratic. It's not in the interest of the population. Never.
Professor Hallgard, I just want to know the 142 billion euros a year, which they're budgeting for the defence budget. Where do you think that's coming from?
For the Europeans or the
No, it's just the Germans. 142 billion euros.
Well, it comes out of tax people's pockets. We're basically building up the military-industrial complexes of each of the countries. And what's happening, as I said, if Europe is to build up a military because it's afraid the Americans aren't going to support it, it needs to invest in its own military-industrial complex because the Americans dominate. And this is why each one of these countries is trying to develop its own systems, whether they be missiles or fighter jets or hypersonic weapons now, for selling abroad and for their own defenses. So that in itself creates Eisenhower, General President Eisenhower, when he left office, warned against the whole totalitarian aspects of the military-industrial complex, and he was talking about the United States. And no one's really listened to what he says. People should reread what Eisenhower said back in 1960. It is quite relevant to what's happening now. And of course, he was caught up in the Cold War himself, and wasn't able to change anything very radically. And now we're rebuilding that whole Cold War model. And just the very idea was just stated that you can't talk to the Russians. That was what I went through during the Cold War, when I couldn't. If I talked to a Soviet, I was a communist. Of course, there weren't very many Soviets to talk to. But we are. I'll put it one illustration is that, and it affects Germany, is the Biden administration and NATO announced that they will be deploying intermediate range missiles in Germany in 2026 next year. Those are the missiles that started. We almost had a nuclear war over the deployment of cruise and Pershing missiles in 1983. So there's other factors going on here in the behind the scenes that are really related to the military-industrial complex, the competition. We're engaged in the biggest arms race in the history of humanity. Drones are becoming the new weapons of choice, but then you've got hypersonics, you've got the new intermediate-range missiles that, as I said, are going to be deployed in Germany and in the Philippines, by the way, by next year. And it's all aimed at trying to counter what the Americans and the Europeans see as a Russian-Chinese alliance.
Ralph, I just want to ask you, this obviously is question is it a NATO push, or are these European nations acting on their own? France, Italy, we look at Sweden, we've got to blow them up with Helga, and this sort of stuff. I mean, it's a very it's a little bit confusing. I mean, if it's a NATO push, then we have the Commander-in-Chief, Donald Trump, who's trying to do a peace deal. Let's split up Ukraine, but he's trying to do the peace deal. Yet on the other hand, NATO are encouraging, Germany and all the other nations to ramp up their military presence. If it is a NATO push, how do we address that? And if it's not a NATO push, does it mean then that these countries are acting independently? And does this mean that the US has lost its oomph, or Trump's lost its influence within Europe?
No, I don't think so, because if we go back to Barack Obama, I mean, the complaint by Washington that the Europeans are not paying their fair share when it comes to defense, that there is not enough burden sharing within NATO, that has been a complaint by the United States, in my opinion, a justified complaint for decades now. So a lot of what's going on at the moment, at least these rearmament, let's call them plans for the moment. We'll see how much of the money is really going into arms, into military readiness, and how much of it will be funneled into infrastructure projects and into pensions. I mean, just one example, a quick one. The Italians already tried to, this was then shut down by the United States, they tried to build the bridge between Sicily and the mainland and to declare it as military spending. So I think there will be a lot of funny business when it comes to that as well, because always remember, when the French tried to increase the retirement age by 1.5, 2 years, that's led to massive protests. So we talk about Europe, I mean, it's the same as the debate currently in Germany about reforming the pension system. Like, these are the things because of the demographic development. And I know that's a boring topic, but if you have a population that is pushing towards 50, retirement is more important for them than going to war. So as I said before, I repeat myself, a lot of these plans can be made on paper. A lot of it can be planned to be shifted towards the military-industrial complex, although I have to say that most of that industrial complex will be in the United States, because Europe is deindustrializing. So this is the next benefit for the US. If Germany spends 5% of GDP on the military, a lot of that money has to go to the US because they're the only ones who have the production capacities. So again, great deal for the United States. They have to spend less money on NATO and they get more money because the Europeans have to spend more on European weaponry. But I always return to my point. The European people, given their current ideological and cultural conditions, have no appetite and no stomach for any kind of war readiness beyond mere rhetoric. As I said, what people are concerned about is their pensions, their retirement, safety in the streets, trains running on time, all these things. So the idea that there would be a huge public outcry in support of going to war with any country, I think on behalf of the political elite, so Friedrich Merz and others, and Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, is delusional.
Robert, I actually think that if government wants to do what it wants to do, it's going to do it. And it may take a little bit longer than they anticipated, but they will do it. Unless you have a great swell of activity from just normal residents, and they become one unit, so you've got strength in numbers. If you look around the world, it's not all that prevalent at the moment, that strength in numbers, because if you look at what government's doing, and just go back a few years with COVID, you'll see the and just look at NATO. Look at how NATO is getting stronger and stronger, and it's Russia is getting more evil by the day. So government can do what they want. How do we address that? How do we say enough? We don't want to go to war, because what I'm seeing is if government wants to go to war, it's going to go to war.
It's a very important point you're making, Mike. It's really, and Ralph, I like to listen to what you said, because it's extremely insightful, and it makes my mind working, saying, shit, it's even worse. What we have here right now is that, yes, we have a population with an average age of 50, having to decide whether the young guys might go to war or not. So if you have this, so this is also maybe a reason why war can happen, because the people who are the majority in the society will think they're not affected. Because of course we are all affected, because war is creating an incredible debt issue, which is making out of all the nations which have so many debt slaves to the big banks. This is also an aspect in terms of power, in terms of who has a say in what is happening. I mean, if you pay a big chunk of your annual budget, and then an even bigger chunk of it to the banks, it's a way of killing, the infrastructure. It's a way of killing liberty in what efforts you want to give. This is also an aspect you have to see. And the point you made, Ralph, is extremely important. Most of the money spent in buying arms and other weaponry will go to the United States. In addition to this, the big German and European manufacturers of these arms are owned by US corporations. So they're the highest stakeholders. So it feels, if you look deeper, it feels anyway like a nudging, a foreign influence over the population. And then some people will go along with it. And, the fear of Russians have been built up from the year 2000 on. And there are many, 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 many stories, like young girls being raped by Russians. And then months later, you learn, in fact, there wasn't a rape at all. And so you had but this news, of course, has been seen by less people than the first news. So you have this anti-Russian propaganda, I have to say, for years and years and years on. And some people do believe it. It might be just 20%, but I'm afraid it's even more. And the worst is, you might remember that the Pershing II rockets that stationed in Germany in 1984. 83, sorry, were extremely, were a huge issue. You had millions demonstrating in Germany. And what is happening today? It's crazy. So, I mean, we had maybe hundreds of thousands of demonstrators. The first big demonstration in Germany against the COVID measures. Okay, it's big, but it's not as big as the Pershing II. But today, you have 10,000, 5,000, 2,000 people, 500 people at the demonstrations for peace in Germany. It feels like either people became apolitical and said, look, do whatever you want, I don't care about what is happening to our society, or they're just with the government. I think it's rather the first. I think it's what I just said. We instead of having a society, or instead of having interest group in our society, we have now a mass which is malleable, which you can influence, and which you can manipulate.
I hope.
No, I just go back to the Vietnam War days. Nixon called that the silent majority, and he was able to manipulate the silent majority is for me, and prosecute the Vietnam War, which he himself postponed rather than engage in blocking Johnson from engaging in peace negotiations. Anyway, that whole era, I grew up in that era, and I didn't want to be drafted to fight some damn war out in Vietnam that I had nothing to do with it, had no relationship to my life, and I was lucky. The draft ended my year, but we had a lottery back then, and if your number was under 100, you could have gone off to Vietnam. So I lucked out of that, as I said, but still, it was quite traumatic, and I feel for the young men and women who are now being at least told that they will have to enlist, or have to register, and then maybe be enlisted later on. And yet, if the politics work the way they did in the Vietnam War era, they will be enlisted in just a few years, because the tensions are mounting, not declining. That's why I think the European leadership needs to get behind, as I said a couple of times, get behind a peace initiative as opposed to a war initiative.
I keep this going for a second. They all know if there's a war between Europe and Russia, it's going to end up in tears. I mean, no one's going to win. And you'll find other nations from around the world will start to become part of that. The global creep will be very quick indeed. Australia, for example, has said we're going to support Ukraine because we're fighting for their democracy, and we're going to give them more money. So what that would mean, and we've talked about war here, so one would assume that if Europe does go to war with, or most of Europe goes to war with against Russia, that other countries far away will become part of that, and we in fact then will have a world war. Maybe not necessarily with the big bombs, but probably if you're losing a battle and you want to win, you're going to have a bigger bomb, which could be the end of mankind. So I'm just wondering if they all know that the end would end humanity, if this is part of the whole propaganda to show that that they know full well at the end of the day that Ukraine will be divided, Russia will go home and lick their wounds, and business will continue on for another decade or two. Would that be the case if you're trying to create the panic and the intensity and the stress involved of your country going to war, and then you go, we've seen the light. We're not going to do that now. We're going to have peace. It does give a country an opportunity to withdraw while still having good standing in their own opinion.
Well, I would, yeah. It's managing this is. I mean, I don't think there's really any management capable of manipulating the public in a way that suits the military-industrial complex the way they always want. In the Vietnam War days, as I said, they tried to get the public behind them in the war effort, and really failed. But it wasn't really the public. It wasn't the protests at the end of the war. That's another thing. Anyway, I think in today's situation, I think just to pick up your first point, we are globalizing the war. Just the other day, the Ukrainians hit a Russian energy complex that apparently has cut Kazakhstan. 80% of Kazakhstan's oil goes through that complex, and now that it's been cut out, they have to rebuild it. So suddenly, you're going to get more and more states involved in this conflict, and it's going to spiral outward. And if this war continues, it won't be NATO first. It will be another conflict somewhere else. It could be Moldova, or it could be North and South Korea. Watch out! There are all sorts of games that can go on that have nothing to do with the Ukraine conflict itself, that would spiral out in new directions. And that's why this war has to be put an end very soon. And the other point I didn't bring, in addition to the deployment of the intermediate range missiles in Germany and in the Philippines, by the way, next year, is the fact that the New START treaty is expiring in 26. We're already in the middle of an arms race, and we're going to be in an even bigger arms race if this treaty expires. So, and isn't renewed in some way. But it doesn't look to me, as far as I can tell, that there's any real negotiations going on, because the systems there's so many new systems coming into the weapon systems coming into the grid, that I don't see them talking about them or getting anything resolved anytime soon. So my point is that this threat of war, a bigger war, is very real, and maybe that might hit some people in the head and said maybe it's time to stop now. But it didn't work in Vietnam. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, Ralph, we had some military people on the other day talking about war. You said the problem is politicians think they can control a war. But once it gets going, you have no control over that. It will go wherever it wants to go. The blustering, if it's not bluster, if it is a legitimate threat that they're going to stop those evil Russians, do we have the same problem then within Europe, that this war or this controlled war will become uncontrollable, and we will then have probably the end of at least Europe, if not mankind?
Well, I would say with very rare occasions, the concept of the controlled war has always been problematic. You can point to the 19th century, or you could point to wars like the first Gulf War, where one side is just so overwhelmingly powerful that there isn't really a competition. But you mentioned something that is equally important, which is, I believe, I can be wrong in this, but this is my personal assessment, that many of the political entities, many of the states in Europe are standing on feet of clay. And very often a war is precisely what is then the trigger to bring the whole thing to the brink, or to breakdown. I mean, we saw this, everybody always makes these historical comparisons, that I do too. But one that I always find interesting is 1917 in Russia. There is if you fight an unpopular war, or let's say if you cannot take the people along with you, revolution is absolutely possible. And I always find it ironic about how quickly things that were unthinkable at one point become very real the next. Nobody in 1914 had any idea what the world in 1918 is going to look like. And I think the same is true in Europe at the moment. Nobody at the moment could imagine a world without the European Union. Nobody could imagine political change in the sense that maybe, Germany or France will no longer be parliamentary democracies. But as you said, if a war breaks out, if people sense that the sacrifices are too high, is it really impossible? I don't think it is. So the danger is not just when it comes to fighting the war. I just think the danger is also, or some people might say this would be a good thing to happen. I don't know. That's a separate debate. But I do not think that one should underestimate the level of anger. And I think that Robert can say more about this, particularly in Germany, the level of anger among the population since the great financial crisis, since COVID, and now with the Russia policy. At the moment, people are, again, they're still somewhat calm. They don't go on the streets. They don't protest. But did anybody in the Soviet Union, or did any observer of the Soviet Union really anticipate, let's say in 1987, that 5 years later the Soviet Union would be gone? If you would have said that, a few cranks did, but that's the point. If you said this in 1987, people would have called you a crank. Even Samuel Huntington and others said, well, we have to make peace with the fact the Soviet Union will stay around for the future. And look what happened.
Robert, I've got to ask you, and I'll go back to Glenn Beck when he was talking about the economies around the world all failing at the same time. Instead of one coming up, the others dropping, they're all going down. And he went through three scenarios, and each one of those scenarios, it was planned. They knew exactly what the world was going to look like, and Hall mentioned that we don't know after a war what it will look like. And I think also Ralph mentioned that after the end of the 1914-18 war, no one knew what the world would look like. Here we have a scenario that they're saying that they do know what it looks like. And just say, for example, if we get to that penultimate, about to have a war, and we have peace. But what they've done, they've achieved what they have planned to do. And that's to have basically a one world order.
Wow, you said what I wanted to say. I think, yes, it's not a secret that there are very strong forces who want a world government. They call it right now global governance. And you see it in a gazillion little hints all over. If the soccer world championship or is in the United States, Canada, and Mexico at the same time, and they create a kind of union as similar to the European Union. It is what in the 70s Henry Kissinger told as a first step towards world government, that you have unions of nations, so that the nation state in itself is weaker, and resembles rather to a state in the United States or to a state in the Federal Republic of Germany. And this is a step towards a world government. And to have a world government, what do you need? You need an even playing field, and you need a wish to change. So the public anger, which you just described so well, yes, you see it everywhere. I've been to France recently, and they told me 90% of the French hate Macron. I think in a couple of months we will have the same in Germany. You know, you had the approval rates are falling for all politicians, and you see it in the United States. There's a sense of civil war. I mean, I think it's exaggerated. There's no civil war, but you have this tension, and you have this overall anger, and you have the wish for change, and the so-called extremist political parties live from the fact that people are unhappy with everything that is proposed with the former parties. I don't know what these political parties will do precisely. When we look at Italy, it didn't really change global politics, you know, that to have Meloni as a prime minister. So I think, yes, I think the overall agenda is to weaken nation states, to have, and that the anger against European Union and the war effort and the government itself might be turned towards something which is a world government, which we saw in many measures during the COVID era. I think war will happen. I think I don't see the psychological force within the population to really say no to what is happening, because of the very fine tactics, what I just said, with the slippery slope. It's so subtle that you cannot really say no, because it's like, oh, it's just a tide change. Would I do a revolution for this? So you have this anger on the one side, and then you have the subtle changes. It doesn't fit really together, but it works.
We do have to wrap this up. We've gone way over time, and I apologise, but I think it's very important, and I've enjoyed this immensely. Just in final, Hall, we've thrown up the issue that is it planned at the moment? We have, if you look at many countries, they're suffering, going through the control of the internet, control of their citizens. Look at Australia, look at the UK, and what it does do. And look at the US, even with Pam Bondi saying that we must roll out hate speech. Already you're in deep trouble when that comes from that particular administration. Having said that, if they control all the narrative or the comms out there, and you only have then the legacy media, wouldn't that then assist in, if you have a major plan, such as Glenn Beck said, one of those is planned, and you know, whether it's WEF or whatever. At the end of the day, this is all planned. Where do you think we'll be if it is planned, or just your own thoughts? Maybe it's not a concerted effort from nations around the world, but it does seem odd that Australia would send its troops over to Ukraine. It's very odd. And you look at what Starmer's doing. He would love to have a bit of a stoush and look at the Stripple findings. All bad Russia. But is it a concerted effort to bring the world, all the governing bodies such as Europe with von der Leyen, and even look at China. China can't be ruled out here. If you brought the whole world together and had a one world order, and the fear of having got so close to a world war, and the world says, and you just have to look at Australia, they're going down this path, and most people are agreeing with it. Could you conceive that? And as was mentioned, no one, with the Soviet Union, nobody thought that the wall would come down, that you would have no more Soviet Union 5 years prior. Can we say that there is a chance that a world order would be in place, and that all of a sudden you have Europe, the US, China, and the major ones, have all said, okay, we're now going to control the world as is. Could that be a possibility? And this is all part of the play acting to get to that particular point.
Yeah, I don't know how much, there's too many contradictions between the different elites to say it's absolutely planned. But in the case of Australia, certainly you've become a member of the AUKUS Pact, the US, UK, and Australia, which is a pact to contain China defensively, and that's directing your ideology, your support for Ukraine, because the United States wants all the allies to back up its military goals. So it's not just in Asia they're worried about. They want the Europeans to help out more in Asia, and the Asian, Japan, Australia also helping in Europe. So that's part of that's a plan of an alliance. Now, on the other hand, if the United States can begin to talk to both Russia and China, then we get into a new dynamic. So if the two sides hit themselves so much and they say, oh no, we're not going to go any farther, we don't want a major power war, then you might be able to get some deals, as in Trump's language, and begin to reconcile the major powers. But in a major power reconciliation, that means you're allowing China and Russia to establish some hegemony in areas that you are fighting them against. So you could have a kind of peace, but it would be a negative piece of major power domination over certain areas. We've already seen that with China and Hong Kong. We're seeing that with Russia in eastern Ukraine, and the United States is now moving into Venezuela. So we have a brave new world, not brave new, 1984 kind of situation there, where if that's going to be called world order, I don't know what it is. It's not really a world order. It's not global governance. But it's very frightening. So there is an option, as I said, though, to try to push all sides into a genuine reconciliation, which is different than a kind of dominance of the major powers.
And Ralph, if you the same question, but if you look at, just to add to that, if you look at the information operation. And you go back a couple of years when it was just with COVID, for example, how the world was going to all die, we're going to shrivel up, be attacked by a flesh-eating virus or whatever the crap was. But the world believed it, and it did unify the world at one particular point. Some great videos came out from China when the acting was just magnificent. But the same thing, the propaganda or the desire to push an entire world population's opinion or the consensus to a particular point, that this is good for you, to have this world order. And if you look at the World Health Organization, they control Australia's health. They control many countries' health. And if they say there's a pandemic or that you need to shut down, we have to do it. So that's already heading towards this one world order. And I'm just thinking again back to what I was talking with Hall about, that we have all these things coming towards a pointy end at the moment, and that's not a coincidence. It has to be planned.
I don't know. I think the idea that there's some grand design that is unfolding and that was planned in some back rooms. I mean, plans are always being made. I think this is nothing new. Propaganda is nothing new. I do see a plan on behalf of the Chinese. I do see a plan on behalf of the Russians. I even see an American plan. Whether these plans are going to work out or not is a separate issue. The only part of the world where I don't see a cohesive or coherent plan is Europe. And this is always the question. You can either be a player at the board or you can be a piece on the board that is being played. And I think this is how it currently feels for Europe. If you do not have any reasonable capabilities on your own, then you will always be at the mercy of somebody else. And we are partially at the mercy of China, we are partially at the mercy of the US, and we have been, energy-wise, at least some parts of Europe, been at the mercy of Russia. And that these countries, all of them, including the US, will at some point use the leverage they have was always to be expected. It was the delusion of European elites that we actually have reached this end of history world where nobody's going to do this. And to make one last point, everyone who observes politics in Austria, where I'm from, but also in Germany, has to admit that sometimes I wish there would be a grand design, but such grand designs take competence. But the European politicians, Germany and Austria at the front at the moment and in the past, did not have competent politicians. I don't think that Robert Habeck was part of a great conspiracy. I just think he was a deeply delusional, ideologically motivated, incompetent politician, which is probably more scary than any backroom dealing.
Well, that describes all politicians. And finally, Robert.
Can I just, but that's the point. That's the point. If you are suspicious and if you think, oh, maybe there's a conspiracy to have incompetency within the so-called political elite, can be an indicator for this. I was researching for a documentary on the Third Reich. I saw the correspondence of the high politicians who worked with Hitler, and I was so much impressed by their low, how would I say, level of German language. It was really, you had the impression to read, children's letters, and the way of thinking was extremely primitive. They were just, primitive criminals, these leading elite. And at the same time, recently I published a letter written by the students of the Weiße Rose, this resistance group in Munich, very famous in Germany. And it's the exact opposite. These people were extremely brilliant, with the German language, extremely intelligent people. So what you had at the time, and what I think is worth a comparison, what you have today is that the more brilliant you are, the more you're on the verge of society, and the more stupid you are, the more power you seem to get. But in fact, the fun fact is, no, in fact, it's not. If you want to control somebody from outside, who would do it? Would I do it? Would you do it? Certainly not. Look at the resume, at the CV of people like Habeck and of course at Lauterbach and these other people. They are not qualified for the positions they are in, and all what they show through their whole life show this. So why are they in the position? Is within the Green Party no other person who is maybe a bit more knowledgeable about economics than Robert Habeck to become the Minister for Economy?
Forgive me to interrupt, but the German people voted for them. Sorry, forgive me for interrupting you, but the German people voted for them.
Yes, but there was a campaign because the Green Party has a basis. But how does this guy come into this position? I think, I don't know it exactly, but I know these people are in, think tanks, have their networks. They're chosen, like the German Marshall Fund, and similar, the Atlantic Brücke, and other similar things. So their networks to support people. There's a system of choosing. In every company, in every structure, in every office, public structure, you will have for years a fight of who will become the president. Even if it's a small thing, and you will know 3 years in advance, or maybe this guy, or maybe that guy. And this fight, in fact, for this very, very, very important positions like Minister of Economy or even, Chancellor, this is happening for tens of years. It's a long struggle to see what person would be in that position. And if these people then are so incompetent, it shows that they might not be the ones to make the big decisions. Maybe some of the smaller ones. And this is indication. You see this in all totalitarian systems. If you see Nazi Germany or even the GDR, East Germany, you see that in these countries, you had these high-level civil servants being extremely stupid. And you had the intelligent people being like either in the resistance and they had problems or at low-level jobs. It's very inefficient. The system is extremely inefficient, but it is authoritarian. And this is how it's structured. And this is why this is a strong, strong, strong indicator to say, look, we have to ring the alarm bells if incompetency is at the high level, because we have brilliant people in Germany.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the fact we can all agree on, we have no idea what's going to happen in 6 months' time. I think personally the machinations are in full play here, and I think if you look at COVID, there's a bunch of theories out there how it originated, who did what to whom and whatever, and each one stacks up. And I think the same thing at the moment. There are all these scenarios out there, and everyone is quite is legitimized because it can stack up to particular scrutiny. However, having said that, the same thing with COVID, and no one knows. No one knows how the whole thing happened. We have now people saying that COVID, there was a vaccine that was made in 2016 that killed people, and they brought that back. So you got all these theories out there, and I think the same thing at the moment. What we can agree on, though, is none of us know what's going to happen out there. I think the information operation is working well above its weight, and I think it's a very scary world we live in. But again, it might just be all part of the stage act, and it's getting to a particular point. Who knows? I don't. Professor Hall Gardner, Robert Sibis, and Dr. Ralph Scholhammer, thank you so much for your time. I've enjoyed this very much. I'm no wiser, but I have enjoyed it. This has been the Protagonists, and this is The World Today.